Okay, so as discussed, I'm going to deliver to you a piece of writing that's already complete. It's by a Dr. James Lindsay, and I found it very interesting. It's lengthy, but it's worth it. And it speaks about the cult dynamics of wokeness. And I'll go on to do further streams of how Christians are converting into this cult, basically. So now we're going to just look at some elements of this indoctrination. So cult indoctrinations tend to follow very predictable stages. Firstly, there's initiation, then indoctrination, and then reprogramming. And these three phases are distinct and they must be understood in their own terms. So cult initiation. Okay, cult doctrine, including extreme fundamentalist interpretations of religious doctrines as cultish, exists generally to resolve a particularly powerful emotional vulnerability in an unhealthy way. This adds another layer of defense for responsible faith, which does so in a healthy way to the degree that it does the same thing, i.e. resolves emotional issues. So the question is where that emotional vulnerability comes from, because with cults, it's always exploited. Sometimes the underlying emotional vulnerability is there for personal reasons or as a result of life events. People turn to various doctrines to explain and contextualize the major events in their lives or to understand who they are. Again, this can be healthy or unhealthy. Vulnerability is also often deliberately inflamed or manufactured for the purpose of doing occult initiation. However, especially in unhealthy cases, would-be indoctrinators ask manipulative questions and try to catch people on the spot in a feeling of discomfort that is usually rooted in their morality and sense of being a good or adequate person. So with religions in general, obviously, many of these vulnerabilities are evoked by asking about one's fears of death. And these leave much room for manipulation by more cultish sects. With religious cults, as we're using the term, however, they can also center directly on making their mark feel morally deficient or unacceptable. And that is the case in healthy as well as unhealthy conversations about religion, i.e. you would ask someone, do you know you're a sinner? And that can be used, what's the word I'm looking for? That can be used in without an altruistic end. So, and did you know you're complicit in racist systems is obviously another, it's another example. So once this vulnerability has been successfully manufactured in the mark, the person that you're seeking to indoctrinate or initiate, or identified and inflamed if it's already present, cult doctrine is given as a potential resolution to the emotional distress. So in short, you give them the bad news, as it were, you get the emotional vulnerability exposed, and then you manipulate it by seeking then to provide an answer to, you know, the complicity within the racist systems as given in the example. So be an anti-racist, help us dismantle the systems, build a better world, etc. And we can note that this can occur in a healthy context or an unhealthy one. And these can sometimes be difficult, actually, to distinguish from one another. The cult application will always be unhealthy in the end, and it can be known by the further manipulation that it uses. It must be understood that this is merely the initiation, either to a religious or moral conversion or to a cult, in which case the word initiation resonates more strongly. Once the doctrine is initially accepted by the cult's mark, the next step is to make the mark feel morally welcome and good. The goal is to give them resolution to the vulnerable and dissonant emotional state that was utilized previously, that bring them down to lift them up again. The mark will be made to feel like they're now doing the right thing where they were doing the wrong thing before. This can still be done in healthy ways, and almost all genuine interventions proceed in this manner. Cults don't diverge from religions and other moral systems at the outset, or they'd never get any marks to convert. For example, of the relevant kind of language, however, consider this. You can be one of the saved and forgiven, as one example, and you're on the right side of history as another. So once the person feels morally welcome and the feeling of vulnerability gets its first hit of calming resolution through the doctrine, the cult indoctrinator will start to increase the depths of the doctrine, usually a little at a time. With a cult, this will involve beginning to teach the quieter parts of the cult worldview that would scare off potential new recruits. And this is where we can find the first clear sign that we are dealing with a cult rather than something healthier, though there's still some overlap and ambiguity. They will deepen the doctrine while informing their mark that they'll be surrounded by temptation, especially from broader society. This gets us the surest first sign that a cult initiation is taking place, though. It's when this warning starts being applied to friends and family who will be described as failing to understand the depth and the value of the cult's doctrine. In fact, that's a clear indicator. Another clear sign that one is dealing with a cult indoctrination rather than something healthier is making the mark live up to contradictory demands. So you must understand racism, and you must admit that you cannot understand racism. You must admit to your complicity in racism and pledge to do better, knowing that it's impossible to do better. You must be an ally, but accept that you will always do your allyship wrong. Impossible demands would scare off a potential cult initiate at the beginning, but once a sufficient level of commitment to the cause has taken hold and taken place, the effect is the opposite in actual fact. Rather than making the mark reject the cult, these impossible and paradoxical demands dramatically deepen commitment to the cult. They do this by re-invoking and massively inflaming the feeling of vulnerability at the core, making the mark burn with a desire to do better, to resolve the emotional dissonance and the white-hot feeling of inadequacy as judged against the cult's impossible standards. Outsiders see through this emotionally abusive tactic immediately. Cult initiates see it as a kind of ritual hazing and demand to prove the faith, very much like an abused child or spouse always trying to do better to live up to the unmet demands of their abuser. The concept of white fragility in the anti-racist woke cult is exactly this kind of emotional shakedown. White fragility separates white people and their adjacencies into exactly two types. So there are racists who admit it and racists who are too emotionally fragile to admit it. You notice there's no scope for non-racists. It's obvious which side the cult doctrine favors. In fact, the cult doctrine is, in this case, is that every white person and white adjacent person is a racist by default. And there are only those with the moral and emotional fortitude to face that, which is good according to the doctrine, and those who lack the necessary moral fibre. So every reaction to a person accused of racism or white fragility itself is proof of this moral failure and the need to do better, unless it is a full-on assent to the cult doctrine, including a promise to consume more of it, change yourself accordingly, do the work it demands, and to do better anyway. White fragility as a concept is explicitly a cult indoctrination technique into the anti-racist cult. Speaking more generally, this is all a process that evolves over time, and when dealing with a cult, it's a largely willful move to bring the mark further into the cult while separating them from other social, emotional, and personal ties. So depending on the degree of vulnerability generated at the outset, if you remember, this process can go quite quickly, taking only a few weeks, although months is more common. The process is summarized as such. Lead the mark to take a step further in. Coach them into rationalizing why that step was good, and then repeat with a further step. Every step in means more investment into the cult and a harder path back out again. Meanwhile, separating the mark from trust in outside influences becomes increasingly necessary. So those might cause the mark to doubt their new faith position while it's still shaky, which would prevent their full submission to the cult ideology. At this early phase in cult indoctrination, where initiation is effectively complete but indoctrination hasn't fully begun, the mark hasn't devoted enough of themselves to the cause to be fully committed yet. So cult indoctrination. Thus, the next step in cult indoctrination is to get people more fully committed. This is actually rather easy, as we tend to commit to new groups fairly quickly under certain well-known conditions. Usual cult deepening methods include public pronouncements of faith before the in-group community, which bonds the mark to them socially and emotionally. This will often involve rituals such as group prayers or singing or outright initiation rituals, which dramatically deepen commitment to a group very quickly. There will also be requests to make costly personal sacrifices to be considered a full part of the new group. This can also include requests for money, cutting ties with relations and family, making pledges, doing the work, and more, including in many cults of personality, allowing the cult leader to have sex with the marks of the desired sexes. So making sacrifice and working on behalf of a group, including a cult, creates deep ties of commitment to the group, its mission, its community also, and it evokes the sunk cost fallacy mechanism, which prevents people from leaving. The fallacy is a reasoning error that basically says, I've invested so much already that it must be worth it, so I'll keep going. It keeps people committed to failing projects, failing relationships, and as it happens, cults, long after they should have abandoned them. And so we hit a particular and important point here. When people like the critical whiteness educator, who knew, Robin DiAngelo, tell us things like anti-racism is a lifelong commitment to an ongoing process of self-reflection, self-critique, and social activism, she is providing a mid-level cult indoctrination path. The demand is to change yourself for life in alignment with the cult's doctrine, including how you think, how you see yourself, and how you operate within the world, and make that change a permanent part of who you are. Notice that it also demands you do the work on behalf of the cult and its objectives, which ties you more tightly to it. This process progresses over time, usually months, demanding more costly sacrifices, costly signals, and doing work for the cult and its doctrinal mission. Costly sacrifices and signals are particularly powerful displays of commitment. And when the mark rationalizes these objectively bad decisions and the cognitive dissonance that that doing them causes, they nearly always rationalize themselves much further into the cult. And these demands must be made fairly, slowly, and carefully, and they're meant to increase emotional investment and commitment. One thing that the cult of wokeness is doing wrong is suddenly demanding too much too fast, partly because it can, and partly because it's trying to do so universally, as we see, rather than in personal one-on-one settings. And this push is breaking the spell for many people, thank God, who would otherwise have been going along and seduced further into this cult. And this may hopefully result in its downfall. At this point, cult indoctrination begins in earnest, and the mark will be urged to consume more doctrine, possibly in immersive quantities. It will be expected to be consumed uncritically, that's very important, looking only for areas of agreement and assent, which are then reaffirmed in the mark by other members of the cult and within the leadership. With the woke cult, the immense and widespread push to get people reading anti-racist and other woke literature in mass quantities right now is consistent with this step. These include the following currently best-selling books, among many others: White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, and Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. When the mark is sufficiently committed to begin uncritically, that's very important, without critique, without asking questions, when they're ready to begin consuming massive quantities of this cult doctrine, they're well into the indoctrination phase. So simultaneously, to prevent critical interpretations of the cult doctrine and ensure full effective immersion in the cult community, marks will be urged to cut ties with the outside voices of reason and dissenting opinions. So broader society itself will now be construed by the cult as bad, evil, complicit, depraved, and any number of other terrible things that the cult's doctrine is adamantly against, e.g. Systemically racist, that kind of stuff. The mark will thus be encouraged to segregate from broader society as much as possible, even possibly becoming hostile to its potential intrusions. And this will eventually include encouraging cutting ties with family and friends who remain outside of the cult, which at this stage is fairly easy to achieve because the indoctrinated convert is almost insufferable to be around anyway at this stage. Before long, the cultist will convince the mark that every voice that disagrees with the cult is somehow demonic and out to pull the mark away from the cult. And this is relatively hard during the cult initiation phase, during which the increasingly sunk cost of participation is mostly what keeps the mark in. But it becomes very easy once the mark is taught to see it, meaning the way the outsiders try to get them away from the cult for bad reasons, as the cult defines them, at which point they lose all trust in outsiders. Once the cultist starts to turn on outsiders as though they are bad influences, only trying to pull people out of the cult, it's extremely difficult to get them to change course. They are more or less indoctrinated by that point, completely and utterly, and very stuck. And then the project changes completely. And with indoctrination complete, the cult reprogramming phase begins now in earnest. And as an aside, before I finish this section, of course, these phases do have a lot of overlap and can be, quite fuzzy, but the descriptions and the progression largely holds. So continuing on with Dr. Lindsay's piece on cult indoctrination, specifically with wokeness cults, or the cult of wokeness, as it were, we're now going to look at cult reprogramming. Once the mark is properly indoctrinated, the objective becomes to reprogram the mark to get them to think differently. The goal is no longer to indoctrinate on what is right think and wrong think. It is to make the Marx thinking completely in line with the view of the world described by the cult doctrine. This will let the Marx see the truth of the doctrine for themselves everywhere in the world. That is being woke. In the case of woke cult programming, there's an older and more formal name for that view of the world, which is having a critical consciousness. Having a critical consciousness occurs when one is able to see the problematics in everything, where problematics are any deviation or potential for deviation from the cult doctrine anywhere and in any aspect of society. This includes speech, writing, institutions, thoughts, people, systems, knowledge, history, one's past, and society itself. So this may get a bit heady, but it's important. Critical consciousness is formally the cult mentality of Karl Marx's conflict theory. Conflict theory, in its briefest explanation, is the idea that society is broken into different groups or classes. For Marx, they were economic classes, and for the woke, they are social group identity classes. These classes are oppressive on one side and oppressed on the other, and in conflict over this. That is, conflict theory is the belief that different social groups in society are always in conflict with one another for power and dominance, and that rather than working together in complex, dynamic ways that can be mutually beneficial, they're at war. A critical consciousness means realizing this and that you're somehow personally complicit in creating the material conditions for that war and need to do better, either by renouncing your dominance if you're on the side of the oppressor, or by agitating for a full-on revolution if you are on the oppressed side of the equation. So critical consciousness is therefore a very cartoonish us versus them reading of the world. This mentality, of course, tweaks various psychological and social impulses in people as described in social identity theory, for example, and dramatically increases what's called parochial altruism. This means strongly favouring the in-group, which is here the cult, and forgiving it for every excess and abuse whilst becoming overtly hostile to the out-group. And in this instance, that's everybody else in society and society itself, and reading everything it does in the worst possible light. This is obviously core to the present sociological dynamic. It's also dramatically, it also dramatically increases cult commitment, adding an overtly warlike tenor to the us against them mentality, which in critical cults like wokeness is us against the world. And now we'll look at the cult mentality. It's very important to stress just how difficult it is to break someone free from a cult mindset once they've adopted the relevant cult consciousness. So once reprogrammed, they will think the way the cult doctrine views the world. They will have to put on the cult-coloured glasses of whatever cult they have joined, and they will see everything in the world through that lens. Everything will be construable as supportive of the cult's doctrinal claims about the world, including where the cult doctrine gets things right, and also where it identifies the evils in the world that would challenge its very existence. People who've been reprogrammed into a cult mentality will perceive all attempts to free them from the cult as malicious attempts to drag them away from their community, and crucially, back to the bad emotional place that they have come to strongly associate with the awful feeling of vulnerability that was used to initiate them in the first place. The doctrine is the opium, as it were, that dulls their emotional pain, given the context of the present discussion. A bit of tongue in one's cheek. In this sense, anyone trying to talk sense to a fully reprogrammed cult member or trying to pull them out of the cult will be, in a very real sense, interpreted as attempting to harm them. And this is because the cult doctrine is the proffered resolution to the pain and emotional dissonance that lives at the point of deep emotional vulnerability that led them to be indoctrinated and reprogrammed in the first place. You see, it's very circular. And you must appreciate just how much that vulnerability has been inflamed by the cult initiation, the indoctrination, and reprogramming process by the point that the markers become a full-fledged cultist. They've been forced to fixate on that vulnerability under profoundly psychologically abusive conditions in juxtaposition to the cult's doctrine, while making costly sacrifices to the cult and cutting most of their ties, this is very important, with the outside world and therefore any other worldview. Removing them from the cult is therefore perceived as an attempt to take them back to that awful vulnerability, whilst at the same time taking them off their opium and ripping them away from the only community they have at this point, whilst forcing them to face up to the embarrassment of having been indoctrinated and having sunk so many costs into something so toxic. So as you can imagine, this will not go easily. In fact, it will be met with remarkable hostility in the majority of cases. And more than that, attempts to remove someone from a cult will also be framed in terms of you not understanding the cult. This is actually a means of resolving the cognitive dissonance around the cult's doctrine, and it deepens and solidifies commitment in almost every case. The problem isn't that the doctrine's bad, you understand. It's that you, the outsider, just don't understand why it's good. You don't get it. And if you learned to see it the way the cultist sees it, here with a critical consciousness, you'd understand and agree, and you wouldn't threaten them with this pain. And this, of course, tautologically obvious and utterly boring. If you saw things the way I saw them, you'd agree with them. The cultists cannot see this because the result of reprogramming is to have only the cult's lens available for viewing everything. The whole point of cult programming is to make it so that one's inner pain and pathology can only be understood in terms of the cult doctrine. And the doctrine is the resolution to the vulnerability and has been very deeply established as such. More or less all of the critical social justice literature on how we know and understand the world, the epistemology and education over the last decade, including White Fragility, makes this case explicitly. Scholar after scholar makes the case that disagreement with critical social justice, i.e. woke doctrine, is only possible if you failed to engage with it properly. D'Angelo makes this case. Barbara Applebaum insists that the only legitimate disagreement with woke doctrine is to clarify one's understanding. Alison Bailey says all disagreement is an attempt to preserve one's privilege. They've got you coming and going, literally. Scholars of religious fundamentalism call this way of thinking intratextuality. For those interested, and they consider it a defining hallmark of religious fundamentalism, by the way. In the cult sense, it's only being able to interpret everything, including disagreement with the cult's doctrine, from the perspective of the cult doctrine. Of course, one can immediately appreciate how this makes the same demand on the cultist that indoctrinated and reprogrammed them in the first place. Keep reading it and read it right, and you'll know you read it right when you agree with it entirely. If you fail, you didn't understand it because you're not good enough in some way, i.e. you're not smart enough, you're not moral enough, humble enough, willing enough to do the work, etc. And you need to do better. Okay, finally, we're going to look at deprogramming, leaving a cult. Okay, here we go. I read here, the only way I know to affect a deprogramming, these three are the ways. 1, striking right to the heart of the point of vulnerability in a completely different and a more healthy way. The second is the introduction of a severe shock, i.e. the death of a family member, potentially, that creates too much dissonance against the cult doctrines to bear. And 3, finding an emotionally intolerable contradiction inside of the cult doctrine. None of that is easy. In fact, it's all usually very difficult, as highly evolved cult doctrines have fixed these incongruities sufficiently to prevent the cultist from even seeing them. That is, every objection and contradiction has a kind of resolution within the cult doctrine. Though best, number 1, almost never works except in therapy. Number 2, has to induce 3 or it won't happen. So cult deprogramming, there's not much to say because it is hard and usually so deeply personal and individual that general prescriptions, as it were, do not apply. One thing that can be said in general is that cult deprogramming almost always proceeds from an initial doubt that spirals out of control, getting the cultists to start questioning everything they were taught within the cult in something of an avalanche, as it were, of angry skepticism. The deprogramming ex-cultist or apostate, if you will then usually become very angry at the cult and vent that anger at it for an extended period of time. That is sometimes called throwing rocks at the cathedral, as it were. And these will be the cult's most vicious and ruthless critics. Still, regarding the third case, wokeness in specific has a few gaping holes in it, which this kind of observation sometimes occurs. One that sometimes works within wokeness is that the abysmal treatment of women and homosexuals under fundamentalist Islam is both intolerable and absolutely defended at the same time. Under different, incompatible aspects of the same theory. Feminism is completely opposed to these abuses, of course, at a profound moral level, but post-colonial and critical race theory approaches, they utterly prevent criticizing the moral standards of a predominantly non-white, non-Western culture. Usually the accusations of racism and colonialism win out and prevent any criticism over the systemic and institutional abuses of women, because generally speaking, racism and colonialism are seen in wokeness as more harmful. Nevertheless, the contradiction is there, and it sometimes crosses their eyes, as it were, and gets them to start asking questions. Drawing this out for people only works on a small fraction, however. This also can work by exposing ways the cult's doctrine harms its charges in general. For example, woke cult doctrine speaks over and for minority voices and often arranges failing systems that hurt them the most. So we've recently been introduced to the idea that being racially black and being politically black are very different things, and have seen the struggle sessions initiated against racially black people who are not correctly politically black. And though people haven't generally known this about the woke cult, this limiting and inherently political take on identity is a central pillar of woke cult doctrine. We've also seen devastation in communities that mostly served black and other minority races, and also disabled people, in the social justice riots of 2020. Still, case 3 can be very hard to induce. It often follows from the shock of a tragedy as described in the second case. Obviously, these events cannot be manufactured or discussed into being, though they do happen. Not much can be said about them here, but the author has seen them happen a few times with genuine religious cultists whose parents or children died in a sudden accident, for example, which is very upsetting, obviously. Their thoughts rapidly shifted to God is supposed to be everywhere, but he wasn't there that day, and the whole architecture unraveled quite rapidly whilst they grieved. I'll say even less about the first case, because although this sometimes happens in interpersonal interventions, it usually happens in the context of professional therapy settings and is beyond the scope of what's reasonable to comment upon here. Although it is worth mentioning that the woke cult is not this responsible. They explicitly use techniques and concepts stolen from clinical therapeutic settings in uncontrolled mass settings like classrooms, workshops, and mass media, mass broadcast, and they let amateurs, not adequately trained professionals, do this. This is consistent with the cult programming endeavor, though, because it allows an attempted evocation of the right kind of vulnerability in many people at once. And the ones who show outward signs of it can then be followed up with individually and properly then indoctrinated. This happens on college campuses, universities, as a matter of officially encouraged procedure, including classrooms. And finally, leaving a cult. If someone begins to deprogram from a cult, it's very important that they are welcomed and not shamed for their past participation in it, no matter how bad it was, how cruel they were under its programming. If you understand that they got there in the first place because of an incredibly inflamed point of vulnerability and were then psychologically abused into accepting the cult doctrine above all else, it makes sense why they would have been so hostile. In a practical sense, however, at the point where they first start to break free, they will still have very low trust for outsiders due to their reprogramming, and will still see the world largely as they were programmed to see it. Hostility back at them can push them back into the cult or into a different cult that promises to manage that vulnerability for them, and thus we have former wokesters that go then completely, to the other end of the spectrum. So in general, what we need is to help people leave the cult and avoid radicalizing in any other direction as they leave. It does none of us any good to turn rabid anti-racists into, open racists, obviously. There's a very broad, very sane middle way that holds all the moral high ground and the keys to a properly better future in society. And it's our job to invite people to see it that way. We don't want to scare them off. To summarize then, wokeness is a cult for sure. And I'm going to do a further video on the, what do I want to call it? The obvious symbols, the symbolism and the symbols and the criteria for basically that. I think it's almost a religion. It's definitely cultish. So it's a cult, and it might even be a proper religion at this point. with a describable and a fanatic cult element within it, and protected by the relative reasonability of the broader faith. So anti-racism in particular, under its auspices, is explicitly framed religiously and with clear patterns of cult initiation. And that is what we're up against. So yeah, that's that. Just to remind you, that was from Dr. James Lindsay. He's an American-born author, a mathematician, and a political commentator. And he's written various books. I can drop a link into the description box. So, yeah, I'm going to continue in this vein shortly, as it were, by looking at some of the characteristics of wokeness and how Christians are converting, unfortunately, or unknowingly, to this cult. So watch this space, and I will see you soon. God bless. Bye-bye.